Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alan Fern, the director of the National Portrait Gallery, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here to another in the gallery's series of self-portraits. We noticed about 20 years ago now that many of the people we are one day going to have on our walls, in paintings, or in our galleries, work of sculpture, were still with us. And that to have them come before an invited audience and talk about their lives and their accomplishments and their challenges would give us a kind of portrait that we hadn't had in the gallery before. This has been an enormously successful series of programs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the latest one tonight with Dorothy Height, who, as you all know, has been for 40 years president of the National Council of Negro Women, and for that alone, we would celebrate her. But as social worker, as executive of the YWCA, as UNESCO delegate, she has been a leading presence in movements for civil rights, for women's rights, and family stability since 1935. An astonishing career that, happily, is not yet over. A few facts for the record. Dr. Height was born in Richmond. Family moved from Virginia to Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh when she was young. She earned her bachelor's and master's from New York University, did graduate work at Columbia University and the New York School of Social Work. I suppose in the building now occupied by the Cooper Hewitt. Was it up in the 90s on Fifth Avenue? Very likely it was. Yes, exactly. That's it. So there are other Smithsonian links than just this evening. Dr. Height has more than 20 honorary degrees and countless awards, including in 1989 the President's Citizens Medal. She and the NCNW have just moved into the neighborhood, greatly improving it, down on Pennsylvania Avenue in Matthew Brady's old building. So we're delighted to welcome her to our conversation with historian Marc Pachter of the Smithsonian, formerly of this museum. And we welcome you, Dorothy Height and Marc Pachter.
I'm going to try to get as much of the sweep of your life in our conversation, which means that I hope you'll allow me to start with your childhood, because it's such an interesting childhood. And I'm going to start with a question. Let's put you in our minds in Rankin, Pennsylvania. Though you were born in Richmond, really you grew up there. And when I read about you and heard some people talk about you, one phrase came up that really struck me. They said, you know, Dr. Height was an old child. Now, I think that's a great way to start. What do you think they meant by that?
Well, I think they picked that up from my older sisters, because I was one of two children of both my parents' third marriage, which means that I came late in my mother's life. I never had a young mother. And so often my sisters, when they turned to me for something, said, well, you know, she's an old child, old folks' child. That's so I guess that's true.
Now, did that have an effect? Because really, with older parents, you tend to get involved in different kinds of activities. Did you find, I know how important your mother was in your life. Did you find that you went with her to a lot of her
yes.
events?
I did, and both of my parents were very active. My father was a choir master and a church officer and a Knights of Pythians, and you name it, he belonged. And my mother was equally active in club movements as well as the church and all, so that many a times when I could have enjoyed playing with the other children, I was off to some convention.
Yes. Enjoying that too, probably. Maybe. All right. You weren't that old a child after all.
Looking back, I enjoyed it.
Now, to place you in that community, I know that, of course, the church was very important.
Very.
And, but in addition to the church, which I think was a segregated church in the sense that the congregation was, even if the terminology wasn't used, it was all African American, or was it?
Well, you know, I never thought of it as segregated, but it was all African American.
All African American. Let's
Small
simply,
Baptist church, a little larger than this room.
because I'm interested in the nature of the town, because you had gone up as a family there. It was a mining town?
No, it was a steel mill town.
A steel mill town.
And when you say Rankin, you're really talking about a small borough of Pittsburgh
I
with a
see.
population of about 7,800.
I see.
This was, my parents were part of that out-migration from the South. My mother was a nurse, but she had to go with my father,
Right.
who was a building contractor and the rest. And Rankin was really kind of an outpost of Pittsburgh, and its population was predominantly foreign-born.
Foreign-born.
Yes, it was a white ethnic population.
I see.
Very small black population.
I see. Was this something that was a major factor in how you grew up? Did you find that you felt natural in the community, or the community thought that the African American community was very odd? I mean, what was the spirit of the town as it in school, for example?
Well, when I tell you that we had a very small group of black students, I think we were 9 when I graduated. 9, I see. But we graduated first, second, and third, so we had no problem.
I know who was first.
Yeah, there were. I'm not saying that there were not instances in which we were called niggers or different things happened to us, but it was an interesting community. I went to my junior prom with a Croatian student. He was the president of the class, secretary of the class, and I was the president. So we went to the prom together. It was that kind of a community.
Right, well that's...
And so I think, and I said this just recently, I think that had a great deal of bearing on the fact that I never had to learn to appreciate difference. Everything around me was different, all the time. On one side of my household, they might be singing Italian, another Hungarian. There was a very tiny Jewish population. They were the most unique. We were the next ones.
Okay, that places it exactly. I know that, now this matters in a child's life, I think, that you were a very tall child.
Always taller. Whenever they had a line, I went to the back of the room.
Really, yes.
And I waited for everybody to line up.
Right, because at 11, I think you had reached full height?
Full height.
Right.
I always said I was a height by name and nature.
And you took the advantage of not only being one of the great students in the class, but I think you played athletics. Weren't you on the basketball team?
I was into everything.
You were into everything.
No, I was always a good student. But I also played basketball. I was in the high jump. I also was in the debating team, the Latin club. Almost everything was organized. I was in it.
And probably starting a lot of it. Now, because one knows how your career is going to develop, you always look for early signs, sometimes maybe artificially, of the activist or the person creating. And we know you're creating activities. I saw the only incident that you had mentioned in one report of your childhood that made you focus on activism was the case of the Chatham YWCA.
Yes,
And I wonder if I could hear about that story, because I think it surprised you. You were in the Y, were you not?
Well, actually, we were part of what you might have called the decentralized program of the YWCA.
Okay.
Part of its outreach to the smaller communities. And because Rankin was thought of as a community where there was a tremendous Americanization program, most of the emphasis was there. And I was delighted when 2 young women came from the Chathams, from the central branch of the YWCA. In Pittsburgh, out to Rankin to organize what was then called the Girl Reserves. And of course, I was a member. In the course of it, we would always come into to activities that brought everyone together. And when that happened, I used to sing, and I was usually the soloist for the it's not initiation, but a ceremony by which you become a girl reserve and take your vows and all that. And so, with two white girls, I was one of those chosen to be on a poster advertising certain services of the YWCA, that it offered. So I dared to say to two of my friends in our little group in Rankin, let's go down to the Y and swim. And so we rode on the streetcar 45 minutes, which was what the distance from Pittsburgh. And when we got there, we went not to the branch because it didn't have a swimming pool. We went to the central branch, which was called the Chatham Street branch. And when we got there, we asked for the swimming pool. Where did we go to swim? And the desk clerk was kind of puzzled. And she said, well, I don't know where you can go. And I said, well, don't you have a swimming pool? She said, yes. And I said, well, that's all we want is the swimming pool.
Simple question.
Just a simple question. And she said, well, I'll have to see. And I said, well, it says, and whatever the time was, that the pool is open this time to that time. I looked all this up. So finally she said, well, you're not supposed to swim here. We said, why not? So, long story, but I insisted on seeing someone higher than she was. And when we did, it was explained to me that they didn't have a swimming pool for colored girls. Well, that was quite a blow to all three of us. And here I am, the poster girl, and I can't swim. So I reminded her who I was. I said, you're not the same one. Well, it was a first experience that I'll never forget.
Kind of an awakening.
It was an awakening. But life is so funny. At 50 years later, I had an opportunity, and long before that, to work with the YWCA, but I had an opportunity to tell my story because I realized then by this time the whole situation had changed. But I'll never forget the conversation we had 45 minutes all the way back. Why can't we swim? If we can belong over here, why can't we belong over there?
Right, right.
And never did I dream that one day I'd be working on just those issues for the YWCA.
Yeah. Well, it's the first encounter with an illogical situation that somebody else thought was logical, and you saw how ridiculous it was.
Yes, but the thing I think as I look back, no one thought that they were harming us or upsetting us. It was just, that's the way it is. And, they said, well, that's the way it is. And there was no real explanation except you're the wrong girls.
Right, right. In your extraordinary career in high school, you win an Elks contest for speakers and got, which must have been an extraordinary amount in those days, $1,000 for college.
Yes.
So that's a happy story, but then comes the next sort of surprise, let's call it that, because you wanted to go to Barnard.
Yes.
Why didn't...
Well, I think, just to come back a minute.
Please, please.
You were asking me about my belonging to things. I happened to have been going to a basketball game in which I was a spectator, I wasn't playing. And I saw a sign that said, do you want to go to college? Now you have to bear in mind, I'm talking about 1928, just on the brink of the Great Depression. And it said, if so, go talk to Mr. W.C. Brooks, contact Mr. W.C. Brooks of the Independent Benevolent Protective Order of Elks of the World, which I can say now. But when I looked at it then, I said, what on earth is this? Because it was the Elks Oratorical College. But it was on the Constitution of the United States. I hadn't thought that much about the Constitution, but the research on that, the preparation of that interview, led me to just take out of the series of subjects, Lincoln and the Constitution, well, there were a number of different issues, but I chose the Constitution and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And I think, for me, that probably was the first time I really got into the substantive issues of the Constitution, and still working on them.
And you were victorious. I mean,
Yes, I won my scholarship I went through the lower levels and all the different levels, and that's a long story unto itself. But I won it in the Armory in Chicago with Oscar DePriest, who was the black congressman in charge. I won it there despite the fact that on every level coming up, I had been prepared to make a 20-minute speech. And when I got there, the finals, the word didn't get to Rankin. And so I didn't know that I was to be a 10-minute speech in the finals. But somehow or other, with my mother's support and a few tears and a few other things, I got it down to 10 minutes, and I won it then. And it was that led me to want to, to pursue Barnard College.
When you decided to go to Barnard, and we'll hear in a second why you didn't go, had you an intention of a career at that point? Very, very rarely does an 18-year-old necessarily know what she wants to do, but did you have an idea in your head of?
I love the sciences, and I knew that I wanted to be a physician, but that I wanted to move on to psychiatry, and that was my goal.
So that was the game plan.
That was the game plan.
Well, Barnard was going to be one step in that progress. Why didn't you go to Barnard?
Well, my brother, who was in medicine, suggested Barnard because he said that was a good school for medicine. I went up and I took all of my principals and all gave me all those nice letters.
Letters, indeed.
And then I went up to New York. I took the Barnard entrance examinations. And after I received all of that, I waited. Then I got a notice that I'd been accepted. Then my brother, whom I mentioned, was really at that point dying of tuberculosis at Bellevue Hospital. And my mother and I had been in New York seeing him. And we literally were in New York when a telegram was sent to my house in Rankin asking me to appear at Barnard for an entrance, some kind of entrance exam. Well, this meant that we arrived, my mother put me on the train, and I went back to Barnard. Unfortunately, the train was about 20 minutes late. But when I went in and talked to Dean Gildersleeve, I kept sitting and waiting. And I thought, well, doesn't she know that I'm here to take this exam? And when she didn't appear excited, I said, well, you know, I got this telegram to be here, and I'm sorry the train was late. And I said, and she said, well, you don't need to bother. You're young. I was then a little over 15. And she said, you don't need to worry about that. And I said, why not? And she said, well, we have a quota. We can only take 2 Negro students at a time. And we have Belle Tobias and Vera Joseph. And she said, and you would have to wait anyway until the fall. And you've got plenty of time. You're young. You can wait. Well, if you come out of Rankin High School leading your class, and you're going to call up and say, I can't get into college, they won't take me. I mean, I cannot even as I tell it to you, I can feel part of it, because it was a traumatic experience. My sister worried so about me because I was afraid to call my mother. I didn't want to tell anybody. And I pleaded with this woman. I said, but I want to go to college now. Well, my brother, when I called him, advised me that there was another school called New York University. So we got on a bus, went up to New York University, only to arrive and find it was for men only, because I went to the Fordham branch in the Bronx. But they told me, they said, well, you have a few hours. It's now such and such a time. Registration at Washington Square closes at 8 o'clock. If you can make it there, maybe you can get in. So when I got down, my sister, my oldest sister with whom I was living, took me down. And when we got there, we waited online. When I got to Dean Schaefer, she said to me, well, where is your application? I said, well, I don't have one. She said, well, do you have a diploma? And I said, no. And do you have any letters of reference? And I said, no. Well, my sister said, well, Dorothy, show her your letter from Barnard. And when I showed Dean Schaefer my letter from Barnard, she looked at it and she said, a girl with these kinds of grades doesn't need an application to NYU, and filled it out. So you can understand why I love the dirty grounds at NYU.
Absolutely. And now I love them too. Wonderful story.
Yeah.
Again, because of the amount of time we have, I'm going to, with your permission, skip over what was an extraordinary college career. You finished in 3 years. You got a master in the 4th year on that Elks scholarship. You organized. You were clearly the woman you were becoming. But when you left, the physician goal was not the one that was animating you, and you had decided, I believe, to start social work. Tell me how you get into the next stage of your career.
Well, as I told you at the beginning, my parents were both in their latter years when I was born. My mother was over 40. So on my way back from the cemetery after the death of my brother, who had said he would help me, I realized that I had to carry much more of a load, because by now you have to remember, I graduated in the height of the 1929 Depression. And so I started to study religion. And when I went into a class one day, Dr. Samuel Hamilton said to me, Dorothy, you're too good a student to be in my classes. And I said, why? And he said, well, the church is not ready for women. And the Negro church is surely not ready for you. And that was a blow.
Extraordinary.
So then I took a course in social work for religious workers. I was trying to get something that would help me.
And the church was very important as a framework for you.
The church was very important, and I was very active in church work and youth work and so forth. So after that occurred, I just thought, and I went into this course, and it led me into social work. And I have to tell you that while I was doing this 4 years in 3, I was always trying to search out how I could find a way to get into medicine somehow or other. And I took some night courses in pharmacy, and I decided I did not belong in pharmacopoeia, that I would go crazy back in the shelves. I said, oh, now I know, I need to work directly with people. And so when I looked at it, I said, well, this sounds something like what I would like. And I found myself then moving into social work, because I discovered that it wasn't medicine I was interested in. I was in people and serving people with medicine.
Right.
And that's why psychiatry had been such an interest.
Right, and so with the psychiatric goal, it makes sense.
So there was a relationship.
Now you are a graduate in 1934 or 5 of, with the master's, when you're ready to start.
Yeah, I got the master's by 1934.
1934. And you got a job fairly quickly working in the welfare organization of New York City, is that right? Did you go straight into that job?
It's very interesting, because the social work field assignment that I had took me to the Brooklyn Church and Mission Federation. And there I worked with the Reverend Scott in the highest delinquency area of the city in organizing a Christian center. I even helped him organize the Universal Baptist Church. I taught the deacons, believe it or not. But I mean, I worked in that with him. And in that whole experience, I got exposed in a way to social work. But the connection I have to make for you, when I was 11 years old in Rankin, I lived across the street from what was the Rankin Christian Center. And in that center, they were teaching the foreign-born. It was a tiny little hut, and another little hut housed the director. And every afternoon when I would come from school, I'd stop by and talk to her. Some years later, earlier they had started, but by the time I was 11, they had built what was called the Rankin Christian Center. And that was a very nice building, but it was only for the foreign-born. And the janitor was black. And so one day, when I was talking to Miss Adams, I explained to her that the children in the school made so much noise, they needed to have someone to tell them Bible stories. And I said, you know, that's something I could do, and I could also teach them how to dramatize them. And so she said, and I said, she agreed with me. And I said, well, would you like me to do it? I could do it. Well, she said she could not tell me no. And it's very interesting that years later, she and I were both interviewed for the story of the American Baptist missions, of which the Rankin Center was one. Right. She and I, the author said, told the same story. One day, while I was telling these Bible stories, a woman came to visit, and she introduced me to her. Out of my little Bible storytelling, the center decided to open on Thursdays for the Negro population. So it was not just Mr. Fleming, the janitor, and I, but then it was open to everybody on Thursday. The significant thing is, it was in that field assignment, not a job, but in the field assignment with the Brooklyn Church and Mission Federation in the Brownsville Community Center, that as I finished my degree, Reverend Scott said, we'd like to have you work here, but we have no money. And so he had me appear before the board, and when I did, and the woman, Mrs. Orrin, our judge, was leading it, and she heard all that we had to say, all he had to say about my work, which had been really dealing with a heavy black population in the midst of a predominantly Orthodox Jewish area, and where unemployment was just unbelievable. And so this woman asked me questions, and finally she said, where did you come from? I always say Pittsburgh, because nobody knows where Rankin is. And she said, since you're from Pittsburgh, have you ever heard of Rankin? And I said, oh, yes. And she said, have you heard of the Rankin Christian Center? I said, I lived across the street from it. And Mrs. Judd said, are you the little girl who was telling the Bible stories? And I said, yes. She said, Mr. Carpenter, I will pay that girl's salary. I have to tell you, from then on, and a lot of times when I say to people, you can have a job or you can have your life's work. It sort of revealed itself that whatever my shortcomings, that what I was to do had to deal with the kinds of people, the problems, the things that I've been dealing with, but dealing with people. And from that day till this, I have never really had to seek a job. From that position, the Department of Welfare was seeking workers, and a Miss Kallenberg heard about my work, where when I tell you I got the job, you know, it was $20 a month was a salary. So that when the person from the Department of Welfare heard about what I was doing in the neighborhood and among the people and the kinds of things I was doing, and she had a recruiter came to me and said, would you like to work in the Department of Welfare? And the rest, you know.
Well, I'm glad you made that detour.
No, and I say that because So often I talk with young people.
Young people, yes.
And I try to say to them, don't push so hard to make sure you succeed. Be much more aware of who you are and where you are, and let your work stand up. You know, don't just always, I mean, I find so many, they want to know first how much vacation, how much this, how much that. Find out what there is to be done.
I'm going to tell that to my children. In the New York of the 30s, just to give a mood of the place, an extraordinary number of things are going on. It's still the Depression. There's an extraordinary amount of movement, youth organization in the Christian community. I know you got involved in the Christian youth movement, and we're going to get you to Oxford in a second with that organization. But there's also the communists, the young communists who are there. How are you, as a young activist woman, at this point a woman, although you started college so young that I think you must be in your early 20s.
Well, I can tell it now. When I took the job at the Department of Welfare, I put my age up 2 years.
You did? Okay. Well.
Because I always looked so, you know, I was always so big.
So big.
Tall, so.
Well, you're a woman at this point, and you're having all of these goals and temptations. How are you sorting it out as to where you're going to invest your energy? Were you interested in the communist goals as well as the Christian goals? Did they seem complementary?
It's hard for you to realize now, but you have to bear in mind, I grew up in the day of the United Front. And in the Harlem I grew up in,
right.
Where we who were college students spent Sunday afternoons listening to Du Bois, or where Langston Hughes and Thurgood Marshall and we went to County Cullen's Church and things of that sort. It was that kind of a community, despite the fact that there were no jobs. The place where Sidney Poitier and Harry went, I read for a play. You know, I mean, I'm just saying. So that there was a great cultural experience. Yes, there was. And it was so rich. And despite the fact that people had no money, but there were so many good relationships and so much exposure. So that I think that's the Harlem that I knew.
Right.
You know, and it's so different from what it is today.
And so you found an easy way to pursue your goals in it. I mean, you were clearly effective, optimistic, but were you committing yourself to particular organizations? I mean, the youth movement just starts, the Christian youth movement, in an organized way, I think, at this point.
You see, when I was at NYU,
yes,
I had been so active in my church. I was part of a little Jolly Three trio. We sang everywhere. We thought we were the latest, and that sort of thing. So I was very active. And one of the students who was there, Martin Harvey, was the youth director for the AME Zion Church. Wow. And one day I talked to him and I said, how do I get connected? And so he introduced me to some of the young people, and I became very active in the United Christian Youth, became one of the founding members of the United Christian Youth Movement of North America.
North America.
But in Harlem, we had a man at the Harlem branch of the YWCA, a Mr. Henry Parker, and he took me and a young man, Albert Berry, and talked with us about, because we used to have meetings there, and we organized what was then called the Harlem Christian Youth Council. And we had some 88 youth groups from all the churches, different groups. One of my greatest memories is of the time that we brought Angelo Herndon to New York, and Jim Robinson, who later developed Crossroads Africa, and Ken Clark, who, you know, was in...
What a golden age.
I mean, so that, you know, that we were a kind of activist group. Now, it was just natural for Tony Morgan and some of the young communists to be a part of the group.
Right.
Because at that time, the Axis hadn't sprung, do you understand? And so it wasn't until a little later that there got to be this, the Cold War.
Right, and the divisions.
So we were part of that whole group.
Among the many people you encountered then, I know you had some either connection or were influenced by Adam Clayton Powell Sr.
Yes.
As he was clearly a major force
Yes, he was.
in that town. Did you have?
I played basketball at Abyssinian. I was a satellite, they called it. And Dr. Powell took me and Olivia Stokes, and we helped him edit his book. And of course, then his son Adam was there, so we had a very close relationship through the years.
His son, of course, the future congressman, his son organized a strike against the merchants of the time?
No, it was called People's, it's not exactly, but People's Crusade.
People's Crusade.
That was an effort to say that he awakened us all to realize that we lived in a community. We spent our money downtown and on 125th Street, but not a single dark person worked there. And so he brought us together. We had mock sessions on how you're going to go, and I was assigned to go to a record shop with another girl, and we went to this record shop, and I was then, I was a little bashful. Nobody ever believes that, but I was always fairly shy. And so, but the two of us went together when we got down there. The thing that struck me was, this man looked at us and he said, "Why don't you go up to Spears?" That was a furniture store on the corner of 125th and 7th Avenue. He said, "You can't steal that furniture, but if I hired any of you and you came in here, you could steal my records." Well, that's all I needed to become an activist. We went back, we told Adam, he told us how to go back. We learned how to go back down there. And before it was all over, we had him one of those signed on a dotted line.
Wow.
But it was a very interesting experience because what we were recognizing was that this man looked at all of us as thieves. He just assumed he would lose. But let me tell you one other thing about the communists. I am grateful that I had that kind of encounter. When I came here to Washington to work with the YWCA, they thought they were doing a nice thing, and they took a picture of the World Congress of the World Youth Congress held at Vassar.
Right, at 38.
With Eleanor Roosevelt on the top doing her knitting, and blonde Carl Ross of the Young Communist League leaning over talking to little dark me. And this made a nice picture. They had it on the bulletin board. They thought it was a nice thing. They didn't really realize that that was not just the young white fellow, that was Carl Ross of the Young Communist League. Because between the time of that conference held at Vassar, where Eleanor Roosevelt was our host, and this conference, the whole picture had changed.
Changed, just in that time.
And in that period of time, I would have been associated or considered a communist. And so I found a way gently to take the picture down because I did not want to be introduced through controversy. But it was the young communist at Vassar who one night challenged me and all of the YWCA delegates there. I didn't work for the YWCA then. Yeah. And he challenged all of them, and he said, every time we want to say, do the preamble, you all insist in putting God in it, or a creator, or something. And he came to me in the pub at Vassar, and this fellow said, "Dorothy Haight, every time I say anything, you come up with God. Don't you know I can fly in the face of your God?" I'd never heard anybody say anything about God like that. I thought, fly in a... I said, do you know who gives you the brains to fly? But it said this to me, that I had to be able to speak up for my faith as he was for his.
Yeah.
And one of the things that concerns me, has concerned me through recent years, is the lack of issue concern among so many young people who are making it and
Right.
advancing.
But they don't care
But
enough.
they haven't had their faith challenged. I mean, I think that's one of the things. Or they haven't had to defend their faith, I'll put it that way, in many instances. And that's what many of us, we at Vassar, all of us from I was by then the vice chair of the United Christian Youth Movement, and we at Vassar spent the time figuring out who would go sleep, because the communists never went to bed. They covered every session.
Many have thought that.
It looked like that. So that what we said, when we leave, they vote something. Then the next morning, we have to try to reverse it, and it's more difficult. So what we did, we would say, you go sleep, and you stay. And we learned to outsit them, and so on. But I mean, it's that encounter that for me was useful.
Right. You did you a favor by
Yes.
challenging
And
your
later on, when I heard Eleanor Roosevelt, not heard, but when I saw her write in her column that she was advising all her young friends not to enter government, because you remember the McCarthy era came
right,
along.
indeed.
And just because you were sitting in the same room, therefore you were called a communist. Or just because I had this conversation, they would not know what the conversation was.
Right.
So she wrote an article and then sent each of us a copy of it. And in it, you may not know that Joe Lash suffered a great deal
Yes,
at the hands of the McCarthy era.
I did.
But she put it very clear. But for me, it was a real challenge
Right.
to be a part of the United Front.
Right, the
Because
crystallization.
you had to know who you were and what you stood for.
While we're on meetings that were so important, it strikes me as I read about your life that when you went with a delegation of 10, I believe, to Oxford in 37,
37.
that was another one of the pivotal moments where this one may have shaped your international perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit about why you went there? And it was also the time of Scottsboro. I mean, it was an amazing time in general.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, Paul Ward was the chair and I the vice chair of the United Christian Youth Movement of North America. And we were among 10 young people chosen to go to the World Conference of the Churches dealing with life and work at Oxford, England. I was very fortunate in that Dr. Mays and Mrs. Mays were my chaperones, and we all traveled together. This was a very significant meeting because it dealt with the role of the Christian in dealing with issues affecting life. I chose the economic order, and that was very helpful to me. But I think one of the most significant things about it was that here we were, 10 young people. There were 34 young people in all from the whole world. But because this was not a conference of young people, this was a conference of the clergy of the church. And so we had the experience of sitting in the choir stand, unable to speak. You know, we were not permitted, we were there as observers. That was a very good experience. I chose the economic order and was able to get into the sessions and assigned to work on the sessions on equality with Professor Tawney, who was an unbelievable teacher, but who had a depth of understanding of equality that certainly changed my whole view. I'll never forget the time in the meeting when a young man from Wales challenged him. He said, you know, we've been here 2 weeks and we've been talking about equality. And he said, I look at the Welsh miners, I'm a pastor there, and you cannot tell me that the Welsh miners and I are equals. I don't know what he would have thought of me, but response of Professor Tawney rang with all of us forever. I mean, I think we'll never forget it. He looked at him and he said, "Pastor Charge, when I was your age, I too thought that a role of the Church of England was to see that there was one gentleman in every city."
Wow.
And it made us all, we were just all devastated. We spent hours really seeing what that meant and realizing how often, it wasn't just Mr. Charles, how often you're in a situation where you feel that whoever you're dealing with is not your equal, just because they're poor, or just because they're a minor, or because they're this color. You see,
Right.
it was a learning experience of the deepest order.
It seems in part that experience which led you to commit to a career with the YWCA. It was not far after, when you returned, that you decided to join the YWCA. What was in your mind at that point?
I think I had never imagined what it would be like to be outside of your country and see headlines in papers, Negroes lynched, Scottsboro boys. I answered more questions about the Scottsboro boys because the papers were full of it, and I had to learn more about it to answer it. But the feeling so many of the people had in England about the United States because of the Scottsboro boys was always something we had to get through, we had to cut through, even with the other young people. And I often think that we do not realize how the world watches our democracy to see how it worked. I certainly felt that there.
I have a friend who was an African-American woman living in Paris during the Little Rock days. And she said every time she would go out on the street, people would go up to her and say, "How can you Americans do that to those little children?"
Yeah.
You know, sort of she was an American to them as part of the oppressive rather than the oppressed. You're right, it's a phenomenon.
Like one of the people we were visiting said to me when I was protesting something, "In your own country, wouldn't you be lynched?" You see it because there's a general feeling that we had to deal with.
Right. Well, we've got to get you into the Y, because if we don't get you into the Y, we won't get you.
When I was at Oxford, I did not know anything about employment in the YWCA, but when I returned, I found that I had been invited by the Harlem branch executive to come to see her. I confess that I thought it was a membership renewal. And so I left the letter for a couple of weeks, and finally Mrs. Saunders called me and she said, "I wrote you a letter." And I said, "Oh, yes," and I went and got it, and I realized she was asking me to come. She wanted me to work at the YWCA, but I just thought it was another announcement, you see. And so that's how I went there as the assistant executive.
So it was an opportunity offered, and you responded as you have in your life when the right thing seemed to come.
Yes.
You did it.
I responded, but just before I had left to go to England, and one of the reasons I think I was chosen was because the Greater New York Federation of Churches youth director, who on a way home from the meeting of the New York State Christian Youth Council said to me that she was going to be retiring and that she wanted me to succeed her. And she convinced me that this would be a good job for me, and it was, because she said, "Oh, you work with all the young people."
Right.
And so I accepted that job. But when I went into the Harlem branch, I told the executive that the executive of the YWCA of City of New York had already hired me to work for the Greater New York. But they were good enough to come together. And Dr. Robert Searle, who was the executive, said, "Well, we're all concerned." So they brought the people from Harlem and the people from downtown, Central Y, and had a luncheon and said, "We're now here to discuss the corpus delictus, Dorothy Height." And so they each talked about what we were doing. And they gave me the chance to choose to work for the youth Director of Youth Services for the Greater New York Church Federation, or to work at the YWCA in Harlem. And after much, turning and twisting, not they, but my own, feeling the freedom they gave me. And he said, we're interested in you wherever you go, whichever you choose. And I chose the YWCA because it still said to me, I remembered a little bit about what Sam Hamilton had told me, but that wasn't the influence. It was the YWCA seemed to me, as I had been active, to have that social action part, the public affairs concern, as well as the direct service concern.
Right. And they put you, or you decided to be in a place where women lived. Was that very soon thereafter that the opportunity?
Well, that was that was one of those things that that happened without agreement. You know what I mean? I went away to a conference of the churches, and when I returned, the executive reminded me that the director of the Emma Ransom House was retiring.
I see.
And since I had handled all the problem cases, she said, well, I'd like you to take it over. And what turned out to be a brief takeover turned up to be I became the director.
Was it there that you brought such eloquent insight to the dilemma of domestic workers? There was something that you called, actually used the phrase, the slave trade.
Slave market.
The slave market.
Yes, you see, in the Harlem YWCA residence was really one of the largest in the country for Negro girls. It housed 260 rooms.
Really?
And part of what we found was during the period of the world's pre-World Fair days and all of that, that so many young women came up from the South. And they had what they call slave markets. And young women would go and stand on a corner, and employers would ride up and look them over and choose one. And then they might go and work all day. And sometimes the girls reported things like the clock got turned back, and they were told they only worked 4 hours when they knew they'd been there 8 hours, and that sort of thing.
Terrible wages, I'm sure.
Right, terrible wages, and some of them were abused, and some were just, there was just a terrible situation. And so, a young man who himself happened to be communist, Lionel Florent, one day called to tell me that they were going to have a hearing on domestic work. And we'd been trying to get decent hiring halls, or to get domestic workers given certain protections and so forth. So here I was, relatively new on the job, but I went down to the city council and I testified. And in my testimony, I said that we were there to protest the Bronx slave markets, whereupon the Bronx councilman said, well, Ms. Hype, you're using an unfortunate term. And I said, we say slave market because the women are standing on the streets, selected as slaves were selected. And I told him. Then the Brooklyn man said, well, they don't have them in Brooklyn. I said, yes, they're on Kings Highway. And I explained to him where they were. And I told him the other streets. Well, by the time I got out of and then what I think was the funniest thing, you know how your subconscious operates. When they kept saying to me, well, you are making this up. And I said, if you come up to Harlem and you said slave market, everybody would know what you mean as if you had said, hidey-ho. Well, I don't know why Cab Calloway's hidey-ho should come forward, but that's what I said. But by the time I got back to the Harlem, to the building, the London papers all over the world, the word had gone out that I'd spoken to this hidey-ho. But that was another instance in which the YWCA took a major hand in trying to protect young women, but also to get some upgrading of household employment.
We have so much to go on to, but we must pause at such a crucial moment. November 7th, 1937, when you are asked to escort Eleanor Roosevelt to a meeting, I think it was at the Harlem Y. Can you tell me a little bit about, first of all, how you got that honor? And we know what happened there, but I'll let you
Well,
tell.
you know how I got the honor?
I'd like to start with that.
I was 6 weeks on the job, and I was single. And so often they act like single people have no life, no family, nothing to do on a Saturday. Everybody else says, well, I have to be home. And so I got that assignment. I think also Mrs. Saunders knew, because she told me it was my work in the community that had attracted her to me to ask me to come to work in the first place. So on a Saturday afternoon, I was to escort Eleanor Roosevelt into a meeting called by Mary McLeod Bethune. I didn't know what the meeting was, but I knew about Mrs. Bethune. Now that was in a day when the wife of the president could get in her own car, drive it to New York, park it in a Harlem street, come in for 2 hours, and then leave and drive to Hyde Park. I was in charge of the residents by that time. And so I had every attendant alert. But instead of coming through any of the doors prepared for her, she chose to go through the center door, which was the service entrance. But I managed to save my job by getting around before she got to the auditorium, and I escorted her in. And this turned out to be a meeting of the National Council of Negro Women, which had been organized 2 years before at that same building. And Mrs. Roosevelt spoke, and as she left, I escorted her out. All the women serenaded her with "Let me call you sweetheart." And then Mrs. Bethune said to me, "What is your name?" I told her. She said, "Well, come back, we need you." Well, I've been back ever since.
Good.
But that was a very good experience because my first assignment was to work with Dennis Spraggs on the resolutions committee. And we wrote resolutions on minimum wage and child labor laws, which you don't need to worry about now, but I mean those sort of things.
Very serious issues. 1939 is a sad moment and a moment of transition. I know your mother died in 1939. And you also moved, I think that was when you moved to Washington, D.C., is that?
Yes, the National YWCA had recruited me 2 or 3 times, but after my mother died, then I felt I would take a job, and I came to work here in Washington at the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA.
Now, again, I know it's a big question, but we don't have much time, but the Washington of that time was a very segregated city. Was this unusual because the Phyllis Wheatley Y was one of 2 Ys, as though there had to be one for white women and one?
This was the only city in the United States where there were 2 associations. In other places, there were, as in Pittsburgh, there was a branch that was what they called the Negro branch.
I see.
But here in Washington, there were 2. And when the YWCA, which was then called the K Street YWCA, was organized in 1905, they invited Phyllis Wheatley, which had been organized 2 years prior, to become a branch.
I see.
And the women promptly replied that they felt since they were there they wanted them to be their branch. And so as a result, there continued 2 associations. That was so characteristic of Washington. It was deeply segregated. There was not a toilet downtown that a black person could use. And during the time that I worked with the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, the cafeteria we had there and the Union Station were the only places outside of their homes where they could get a decent meal, except in a black neighborhood, little restaurants and so on.
A lot of young women were flooding into Washington to work
during the war.
So they would use this as their residence?
Well, yes, but because at the time they were coming into Washington during the war, the government did an outreach program and set up Meridian House and all for white girls. One of the jobs that we had at the YWCA was to protest that there needed to be something built for the black girls who were coming. And out of that, it's a long, long story, because the feeling was, and even the distinguished gentleman, Mr. Taylor, the black man who was running it, said to me, well, the feeling is that black people always take care of their own, and the young women can find homes to live in. And they did, but people were charging them terrible prices, putting them 3 and 4 in a room, denying them services. He made the mistake of saying to me, well, maybe we better bring some of our officials out and let them hear for themselves. And he gave us 500 questionnaires to fill out, had the young women fill out their stories. We distributed them from a Thursday afternoon to that meeting Monday morning. We had everyone fill. And when he arrived on Monday afternoon for the meeting, the YWCA lobby was just filled with girls. But by the time they finished telling their stories, he just said, well, we will have to do something. Wow. And so Slow Hall, Lucy Diggs Slow Hall, Midway, and there was a third, were the outgrowth of that. But it was the active role that those young women played on their own behalf that made it so helpful.
1944, you went back to New York. I know you also had a very terrible accident as well, the
yes.
auto accident. So it was a mixed experience at the time, but you were okay in the end, and you went back to New York to again join the national structure.
Yes, I went on. I became a member of the national YWCA staff.
Did you join the Delta organization while you were in Washington?
No, that I became a member of Delta Sigma Theta in 1939.
Okay,
and it was
because I'm trying to keep track of
I know you are.
your many energetic enterprises. So you were already a member.
Well, you see, it's kind of multiplicity is the description.
Exactly.
In 1939, just before I moved to Washington, I became a member of Delta Sigma Theta.
So you were volunteering with the National Council. You had become a member of the Delta. You're working in and for the Y.
Right.
When you go back to New York, you're carrying all of these various activities with you. The Y at this point is still the one paying you, I think.
I'm employed, yes.
You're employed.
I'm on the payroll.
You're employed, right.
Yeah.
And that period just then and then just after the war was a significant one for the Y, because they were beginning to confront some of their own limitations, I think, on the issues of equality.
Oh, yes.
And you had a lot to do with that, I think.
Well, I went in, just to give you an illustration, because I worked there 33 years. But I went on staff. I was the director of interracial education in 1944. I succeeded Helen Wilkins Claytor, who had done a study of interracial practices for the YWCA. And one of the things about the YWCA that is rather unique, and that is that it tends to turn the spotlight on itself, to study, to look at its own policies and its own practices. And that's what it did, urged, of course, by the students in the organization.
Right.
And my job was then, when the study that Helen Claytor and Juliet Bell had done on interracial practices in the YWCA was to carry the staff role in helping the association implement those policies.
But it's almost the story of maybe the better part of the United States, but the unfolding of the Y's confrontation with its own limited policies.
Right.
Because even 46, which I know was an important convention, and principles of affirmation of a broader vision were made, but you were still fighting that fight by 1970 in terms
Yes.
of really making the organization.
Yeah, and when I started staff a few months ago, I went in as director for interracial education.
Right.
33 years later, having spent 18 years as a director for professional and volunteer training, I had returned after those years when the Civil Rights Movement began. I went back into the racial field, but I ended as director of the Center for Racial Justice. The YWCA itself had moved away from any thinking that race in this country is a matter of race relations. It had come to understand institutional racism. It had begun to look beneath the surface. It had stopped talking about building bridges, but it had sought to understand why you need the bridges. And it's that I think for me was a tremendous experience. And the freedom that the National YWCA gave me to participate in the Civil Rights Movement, along with these great leaders, all of whom were employed by the NAACP and the Urban League and SCLC and the like, but the freedom they gave me to be a volunteer working inside with them really contributed not only to the YWCA, but to the whole Civil Rights Movement. So the YWCA made a major contribution. And in 1970, after, you see, when you mentioned 1946, in 1946, that was my first time to be the staff person for this issue in the convention. In 1946, when the YWCA went into that convention, some 200 associations across the South and parts of edges of the North had come into it determined that it would not adopt the interracial policies. But Mrs. Henry Ingram, the president, met with each group and we worked it through. And finally, when that vote was taken, it said that the YWCA will, that a part of its purpose is to see to it that Negro women and girls are admitted and are integrated into the mainstream of association and community life. And when Mrs. Ingram, after great struggle through that convention, when she looked out at the convention and she said, "Do you think this will be easy?" There was a resounding no. But there was something that happened, I'll never forget, because Dr. Benjamin Mays was the speaker, and he said to them, because so many of them were saying, and so much was being said across the South, the time isn't ripe for this, the time isn't ripe. And Dr. Mays, in his speech, said, if you're a Christian organization, if you have a Christian purpose, it's not a Christian organization, it's an organization with a Christian purpose. If you have this purpose and you find that the time is not ripe, bear in mind the time is always ripe to do justice. And if it isn't ripe, it's your job to ripen the time. And I think that was a turning point in the whole thing.
The organization.
And some from the South, I mean, this was not a question North versus South. There were some Southern and some Northern all the way through, but something happened. So that I was there at that part, but I was also there in 1970 because we had gone through many different steps. We had integrated in all training. We had done an audit. But then, at a great risk, we had a series of conferences of black women. Some people thought that was a backward step. But out of it also grew a realization that there had to be a time for white people to look at themselves to see, what does it mean that I'm white in a country that's institutional racism, or that I am a Latino, or that I am Native American, and so forth. And out of the Black Women's Conference came the action based upon looking at the 7 areas the YWCA planned to act on. And we had a 2-day meeting before the convention. And in that convention, some of them said, everything we're going to talk about has a racial dimension. If it's peace, if it's poverty, opportunities for women, all 7 imperatives And they said, we don't need 7 imperatives.
One
We
imperative.
need one.
One imperative.
And we brought to the convention one imperative. And 3,000 women, all races, all creeds, adopted as the one imperative to thrust our collective power toward the elimination of racism wherever it is to be found and by any means necessary. And that, I think, was a kind of recognition of the role the YWCA had taken, but also the value of all the institutes, of all the roundtables, the discussions of the web of racism, the analysis of the Black economic order, the kinds of things that had been done, so that it had not only a policy, but we went into neighborhoods and found out what was happening to people. People came to the convention enlightened. And it was not black, we were not a black caucus. We were a meeting of the black women who were members of the YWCA, attracted by the same purpose as the white women, and the Native American and other women. And that our contribution was to see, how do we make a movement with this kind of purpose have meaning for all of us in a pluralistic society, and how do we contribute to making our country more pluralistic and recognize difference and appreciate rather than fear difference. And last year, when I was invited back to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the imperative, it said something to me that the theme for the convention in 1996 was the one imperative, to thrust our collective power. And I think that the reason I cite my titles is because, for me, the enriching experience of working with Dr. King and Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young and SNCC and all of that meant that I could bring something to the YWCA, but also that the YWCA contributed so much to me by giving me that freedom, and also the opportunity to work firsthand. We had conferences of white women, of Native American women, of Asian women, of Hispanic women, and of black women, individually. And it was a learning experience, because many white women, I think, had never discussed race without starting with what's happening to blacks.
Right.
They measured it according to what extent they related to, or they had black friends, or that this or that or the other. But when they had to see that we were not talking about relations, we were talking about something that is embedded in our society. And if we don't acknowledge that it's there, we will always keep saying, glossing over. That's why I have to say that I was glad I chose the YWCA.
Dr. Haidt, I'm going to do a radical and surprising thing and actually conclude the interview without having really talked a lot about the National Council of Negro Women, because I think this is the phase that we've talked about, that people don't know as well, that have given the underpinning of your life, and we understand the rest. So many people here will want to meet you. So I'm going to actually let you have that last word, which is so powerful, and simply say that I saw in one of the many things written about you a wonderful characterization by a colleague of yours, a friend, Eleanor Hinton Hoyt, who described you as a dream giver, an earth shaker, and a crusader for human rights. And I think on that note, we have to applaud your life.
why Dorothy I. Height is the leader that she is. Rarely have so many important things been talked about in one of our conversations, and rarely have I thought I could use another 2 or 3 hours, but we're all in your debt for being here. We thank you very much. I need to acknowledge the portrait, the painted portrait that has been sitting quietly over on the side, and tell you that the artist, Simi Knox, is here tonight, and I hope he will stand up and be acknowledged for his work.
May I add that this was Bill Cosby's gift to me to have
Bless you.
this done on my 75th birthday.
Wonderful. We are now going to repair to the second floor just below, where we will have some food, some drink, a chance to visit with Dr. Height. And 2 of our peerless docents are here this evening to lead you, if you would like, down to the exhibition of paintings from the Harmon Foundation on the first floor, which will be open the whole evening. So at some point, I hope that you will all have a chance to look at those portraits and see Mrs. Bethune and some of the other people who were important in the times that we were talking about. Again, thank you very much for honoring us with your presence, Dorothy Height. Thank you, Marc, for a wonderful interview. And thank you for being here.
Well, I thought the interview was wonderful, and I think the fact that the interview took us down a different path of her life and understanding the connections of her why activities to her larger role in society was very important and very meaningful for me to understand more about her as a person, her contributions. I think there's no more important way for us to understand these people and their contributions and the power of their lives than by having them speak to us themselves. And without that, we lose, I think, the nuances and the wonderfulness of them. And those are the things that the later generations really want to know more about and to see for themselves.
Oh, I thought it was wonderful. She recounted history so well and gave us so much information that we obviously wouldn't have had without her having lived through that experience. And she made it so vivid and so clear to us. Lisa might be able to add to that. She is the young lady who organized the portrait exhibition. She curated the portrait exhibition downstairs.
I found the exhibition extremely inspirational. I'm studying a lot of the history that she is working on right now, and it sort of brought it to life, sort of a living account of what happened, which previously I'd only seen in books. So I really was very impressed with how she brought it to the audience and how she brought her message across. And I also found it just really a wonderful experience to have.
Oh, well, the interview was history. I mean, being in the company of Dorothy Height is tremendous, but also being able to hear the stories and put it in context with not only her life, but what's going on today. You know, they say history repeats itself, so this was very special. The Smithsonian was right on, you know, for them to do it.
Listen, Dr. Height was just telling you the things, the life that she has lived, because many of us have been right in there with her on so many occasions. And I happen to have been one because I've been here 31 years in Washington, D.C., and any number of kinds of things that we have been involved in with getting congressional, the Black Caucus, working with them. Then the Black Family Reunion was one of our large concerns. And not only that, we've been out there with Whitney Young and all of those persons in the street. And what she was telling you, none of it was it's a fairy tale. Strategy is really something that she's excellent in, and we are always so happy. I've served time on the board. In fact, I was on the board when we turned Miss Bethune's house over to Park Service. And I also was on the board when we were able to get enough charter donors to go along with us and let us be at 633 Pennsylvania Avenue. And this goes to show that she has perseverance. She doesn't give up on anything. She can be over here doing something today and over there doing something else the same day. It's a delightful kind of person. I would have missed being here tonight for nothing in the world. And most of us are very well known wherever there's a need to help women.
She is a storyteller, and this venue lent itself beautifully, especially since the interviewer was so well prepared and asked so many wonderful questions, that it brought out absolute gems from our history and from our understanding that might not come out in a speech or in some other kind of venue. So I really thought this venue worked perfectly.
And how important is it, do you think, that we document famous figures such as Dorothy in the 20th century?
Extraordinarily important. I have been, in fact, helping Ms. Height for many years now on her own autobiography. And many of the stories that were told were ones that were familiar to me, but yet something new was brought out through the interview process. Some new depth, some new angles, so that one can sit and write by oneself and remember events, but when probed like this by an experienced person, even more rich, wonderful things can come out. So I thought it was very, very appropriate, very timely, and extremely important for our posterity and for African American culture.